It is my really great pleasure to have Mr. Erik Robeznieks here with us today. So we first met, he helped put together, as many of you know, we've been building this website for adolescents with disabilities, and he and his athletes contributed to like some of the most favorite videos that are up there that are most viewed. And I was just really impressed with what he is doing and what his athletes are doing. And so I'm excited to have him here. But for his bio, so following a halted career in able-bodied sport, Erik earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Kinesiology and Health Sciences from York University and a Master's in Business Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Erik worked at Wheelchair Basketball Canada, managing operations for the national program, including being on staff with Team Canada at the Rio 2016 Paralympics and several other major international competitions. In 2020, Erik came to the University of Michigan to work with Dr. Ogunlami as the Assistant Director of University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness. He has successfully helped to apply for and oversee over $1.6 million in grant funding towards efforts to integrate adaptive sports into the community and get more students involved in adaptive sports. He oversees recreational and competitive wheelchair tennis, wheelchair basketball, para track and field, and wheelchair rugby. He also helped co-create and secure funding for the Adaptive Sports and Inclusive Recreation Initiative. With this initiative, public K through 12 schools in our area now include adaptive sports as part of the curriculum. Erik also competes in wheelchair basketball, a 2019 Canada Games silver medalist with Team Ontario, and volunteers on the board of directors for the Para Equestrian nonprofit Therapeutic Riding Incorporated in Ann Arbor. So he is the first person I've ever invited to speak at Grand Rounds. So it's like, wow, 7 o'clock, that's so late. So I didn't warn you about this, but we usually do an introductory question, and so a little icebreaker.
Sure.
So my introductory question to you is, I realize that you are from Canada, and so the cold, and it is like going to be 50 degrees today, but typically, and around February, where would be your dream place to be?
I'm in Ann Arbor. I love being outdoors. That's where I really kind of derive a lot of my mental health from. From my day to day, being one with nature, being outside. So it might be cross country skiing, whether it might be hiking or just kind of enjoying a stroll outside. I love the winter. I love the cold. So that's probably where I'd be during this time of year.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for having me here, and thank you, Dr. Sir, for the invitation to speak this morning. As was introduced, my name is Erik Robeznieks, and I'm the Assistant Director of Adaptive Sports and Fitness here at the University of Michigan. I'm incredibly excited to speak to you all today about a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, the space of collegiate adaptive sports. A question that I often receive when I talk about this topic and when I do my work day to day is, how did I get involved in this space? Why am I here? Why am I at the University of Michigan? And what are we trying to accomplish? My life growing up was, I had the identity of an athlete. I believe that sport is one of the greatest microcosms in life, and it is an opportunity to experience and learn from social situations that prepare you for future personal, interpersonal, academic, and professional scenarios. Being an athlete was my main focus in life until I endured a severe knee injury and subsequent knee injuries to the same knee and reconstructive surgeries. And one of the most prominent things that I recall during that time were all the narratives that I heard from coaches, doctors, surgeons, friends, and family about athletes that also endured catastrophic career-ending injuries that were able to recover and return to their sport. Now, on the one hand, that should feel motivating, especially for an athlete or someone that identified as working hard and not being outworked to achieve an end goal. But it wasn't, because the numerous appointments that I had with my surgeons, sports medicine physicians, physical therapists, all left me feeling like I was on a path to summit Mount Everest just to get back to an arbitrary level of performance that I was at before. And while I'm able to do many able-bodied activities in sports today, physically and mentally, I'm not where I was, and I was not where I was post-injury and post-surgery recovery. And in hindsight, I think the comprehensive paradigm could have been shifted in that entire process in my interactions with coaches, with mentors, with physicians, with surgeons, recognizing that perhaps the end goal should have been getting me back to return to sport for the sake of fulfillment and enjoyment of sport, not necessarily what I was maybe able to do before, but instead enhancing the abilities that I did have at that present time. Concurrent with my medical experiences, I began to reevaluate my path in life. Instead of being an athlete, I chose to focus on my academics, and I pursued my undergraduate degree in kinesiology and health science at York University. It was through my kinesiology degree and through my experiences in my undergraduate career that led me to a career short stint with Wheelchair Basketball Canada, where I was first introduced to them by high performance director Michael Frogley, where I had the pleasure of working under his leadership and mentorship and being exposed to all areas of the organization. Working in a business operations role, working in a performance analytics role with the national programs at the junior level and senior level, I was exposed to all areas of the high performance organization, from grassroots to long-term athlete development to sport science. And it gave me a really strong foundational understanding of what a sport ecosystem should look like that supports holistic development of athletes from an active start to being active for life. And it was in that time at Wheelchair Basketball Canada that I had fundamental experiences that I think really shaped what my career trajectory was beyond that point. Working with Team Canada at the Rio 2016 Paralympic Games, the Toronto 2015 Para-Pan Am Games, being on staff with the 2017 World Championship team, and all the friends and that I made across the globe through the sport of wheelchair basketball. It was in that time that I also had a full circle moment in learning that I could play wheelchair basketball as well. Now, typically for a parasport an athlete needs to meet a minimal eligibility criteria on the basis of permanent disability classification. And that is an incredibly nuanced topic. Classification is highly contentious when it comes to that conversation around athletes and coaches and sport governing bodies. But as simply put as possible, my current function as a result of my injuries and surgeries left me eligible for some leagues, but not all. But that's always an ongoing conversation at the national governing sport body level and can be a lecture in and of itself. But what I love about the sport of wheelchair basketball, and particularly the ethos within the Canadian system, is that they wholeheartedly endorse able-bodied inclusion when it comes to wheelchair basketball. Legendary Paralympic wheelchair basketball, Patrick Anderson said himself and coined the term, "If you can sit, you can play." The concept of able-bodied inclusion is not widely accepted, however, because particularly in the United States, that is not deemed as something that is appropriate when it comes to supporting the opportunity for people with disabilities to engage in sport. But that paradigm is beginning to shift, and I'll expand on that later. To summarize, what I believe through that able-bodied inclusion can achieve through parasport is using it as a medium to create a natural environment for socialization, community, and inclusion. I think that one of the biggest lessons that I took away from my time at Wheelchair Basketball Canada and my ongoing career as a wheelchair basketball athlete is understanding how sport can be a medium. Sport can be an avenue that brings people together and unifies people together. However, over the course of my time at Wheelchair Basketball Canada, through all the narratives that I heard from athletes, from coaches within the Canadian system and internationally, and in my time as an athlete, I came to understand the growing disproportionate opportunities that existed for people with disabilities to engage in sport is by and large, they did not have the same avenues and opportunities or encouragement to participate in sport or physical activity growing up. And as a result, they face a disproportionate health outcomes as a result of that. And as I began to understand those differences and the stigma around being an athlete with a disability, or perhaps the oxymoron of being a disabled athlete, I wanted to understand what could be done to make a difference to facilitate growth and opportunities when it came to disabled sport, when it came to parasport, adaptive sport. And that led me to pursue an MBA where I had an opportunity to do a thesis on the inclusion of adaptive sport in the NCAA. I chose this topic because of all of my cumulative experiences up until that point, recognizing that there were athletes that were going on to play collegiate level adaptive sport in the United States, but not afforded the same not afforded the same recognition, resources, and support that their able-bodied peers were receiving at the same institutions. This was an incredibly enriching experience as I pursued my qualitative study and interviewed people all across the United States to learn about the adaptive sports system and what could be done to impart change in the collegiate system to increase opportunities for people with disabilities to compete in and play in sport. In all the interviews that I had across the United States, some of the common themes that jumped out to me were themes of law, themes of equity, themes of different strategies where we could think about modifications and equitable accommodations when it comes to sport participation. Among the people that I interviewed as part of this research study was Dr. Okunlami, who at the time was in the early years of starting a collegiate adaptive sport program at the University of Michigan. Dr. Okunlami had a great vision of what an adaptive sport program could look like at an institution like University of Michigan that values education, innovation, leadership, and athletics. The network that Dr. Okunlami illustrated of bringing together the disciplines and fields of study in Michigan medicine and University of Michigan painted a holistic landscape that would create not only opportunity for people with disabilities at University of Michigan and in the Ann Arbor community, but serve as a flagship for how this could be interconnected all across the country. Among all the people that I interviewed in my time conducting my master's thesis, the people that I interviewed and networked with, no one had a comparable vision to Dr. Okunlami's. And those motivated and spirited conversations eventually led to me joining Dr. Okunlami to bring his vision, my research, and our mutual passions to life in growing the adaptive sports and fitness program here at the University of Michigan. But before I get farther into the landscape of collegiate adaptive sport and the opportunities that lie within, we can do some level setting around the definition of what adaptive sport or parasport is. Adaptive sports, also known as parasports, are terms that I'm going to use interchangeably throughout this presentation. But adaptive sports are competitive or recreational sports for people with and without disabilities. Adaptive sports use modifications of rules or equipment that allow for equitable participation in sport by people with disabilities. Some adaptive sports are variations of existing able-bodied sports that run parallel to those activities, like wheelchair basketball and wheelchair tennis, while some adaptive sports have been specifically designed for people with a disability that do not have an able-bodied equivalent. The definition of parasport or adaptive sport as presented here very much follows the concepts or themes around universal design. Of understanding through modifications and through accommodations, we can create systems, we can create practices, we can create procedures that are equitably accessible to everyone. To discuss another topic here on the course of parasport and adaptive sports, often a misnomer that people have is that parasport stands for paraplegic, when in fact, Paralympic derives from the Greek preposition para, meaning alongside or beside. So quite literally, when we talk about the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games, the Paralympics is supposed to be parallel to the Olympic Games. And when we think about it in this light, we can understand how we can create systems and how we can create opportunities that are parallel to existing infrastructures, or perhaps find ways to integrate with existing infrastructures such that there's an equitable opportunity for people to find entryways and pathways into sport, into education, work, life, and other areas of citizenship. So building an adaptive sport program, specifically within the collegiate setting, could be a linchpin for growing the parasport movement nationally. But why does this matter? Again, what came up as major themes in the course of my master's research and what we see in our day-to-day work are issues of equity, the benefits of sport, but also beyond what happens within the sport domain, beyond what happens on the tennis court or basketball court or whatever it may be, are the future impacts of sport participation in terms of the transferable skills that are developed. When we look at equity, the proportionality of persons per collegiate sport program is quite disparaging. There are fewer opportunities for people with disabilities, and to put it in the numbers perspective, there are 2.9 million people living with a disability between the ages of 5 to 17 and 50.8 million people without a disability. There are just over 1,100 colleges in the NCAA and about 22 of them have some form of perennial adaptive sport programming. What that means is that there is approximately 45,000 persons without a disability for every college in the NCAA. Meanwhile, there's approximately 138,000 persons with a disability for every collegiate adaptive sport program in the United States. Second is that there's limited opportunities for scholarships and financial support for student athletes with physical disabilities to pursue sport, whether it's the cost of programming, equipment, or even just the cost of attendance to school. Which gets to my third point around equity, is that the lack of programs creates a geographic barrier in a sense, or a geographic or structural barrier when it comes to accessing academic and athletic opportunities at the post-secondary level, and that many student athletes that wish to pursue athletics and academics in their post-secondary career have to go to out-of-state institutions. So that, coupled with the lack of programming support, coupled with the lack of finances and scholarships to support the participation at the collegiate level, creates a huge drop-off rate in that pipeline of people that participate in parasport and ultimately drop off in their participation in physical activity as well. When we look at the physical, social, psychological, and societal benefits of adaptive sport, the benefits of sport physically are well documented. But something that I would like to illuminate is the study done by Ernst Young and ESPNW in 2017 on what makes female athletes winning entrepreneurs. I found this to be a very interesting study and very comparable to the situation we're in right now for people with disabilities. The study found that a majority of C-suite executives participated in university level sport. 94% played sport at one point in their lives, and 74% agreed that a background in sport can help accelerate a woman's career. The positive effect that can have in increasing an individual's capacity to excel beyond their athletic career is something that sport can be a facilitator for. And when it comes to disability, it is a core area of inclusion for the NCAA, just as women are in terms of their DE&I strategy. So while one cannot expect an equally positive outcome if persons with a disability had the same opportunities to participate in collegiate level sport, there is yet to be that equitable opportunity for that to even happen. One can assume that sporting opportunities would benefit persons with a disability in the same way, given all the transferable skills that are derived from sport participation. The last area that I want to mention are employment population ratio statistics. When we look at the numbers, they speak for themselves. In 2022, the employment population ratio for persons with and with no disability for the age range of 16 to 64 was 34.8% and 74.4% respectively. I think when we look at those numbers from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, that is quite alarming in terms of the overall societal impact. But sport can be one aspect, one fraction of what we can do to facilitate a change in that end outcome and the overall societal benefit that can happen. So to fully understand the landscape and trajectory of collegiate adaptive sport today, we need to look at the historical context that shaped the present. And as we look through this high-level summary, we will cover topics and themes addressed in my master's research, but also the paradigms and social underpinnings that exist in adaptive sport and some societal milestones that impact this space. Following World War II, there was a federal bill that mandated veterans with disabilities could receive education and rehabilitation training. There were many more misconceptions about people with disabilities at this time. Largely, there was a belief that they could not live independently. Dr. Timothy Nugent was hired as a director of the first university program in the country for students with disabilities and created the first collegiate adaptive sports program at the University of Illinois, known as the U of I Giz Kids. Dr. Nugent's focus was to rehabilitate the whole person, not just their injuries. And in addition to the sports program, he was an activist and an advocate on campus, along with his students, not just for physical accessibility of spaces and places, but also when it comes to policy and access to education and appropriate accommodations. A lot of his work would go on to inform the Americans with Disabilities Act. To further talk about Dr. Nugent, in 1949, he formed the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, which is still today the governing body of wheelchair basketball in the United States. And in 1970, he created the first women's collegiate wheelchair basketball team, the Miss Kids. Understanding the origin of collegiate adaptive sport at U of I is important because it marked the beginning of the social shift from the medical model of disability to the social model of disability, which I will expand upon further later on in this presentation. In 1956, the first wheelchair track program appeared as a result of being sanctioned at the national level within the United States, again with University of Illinois paving the way and creating many leaders in the space of wheelchair track, road cycling, and marathon races. In 1969, there was a creation of the Southwest Minnesota State University wheelchair basketball program, which is still active and very competitive today. In 1973, there was the social justice and disability rights movement that created the Rehab Act. Before the Rehab Act, the fight for civil rights did not include people with disabilities. Disabled people faced rampant discrimination and segregation largely across American life. In 1973, the Rehab Act was passed, a federal law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. But for years after it took effect, there were no implementing regulations, which did not really have any practical applications in day-to-day American life, until came along Judy Heumann, one of the founders or considered a mother of disability rights in the United States. Judy and other disability rights activists turned to grassroots mobilization and organized protests all across the country. One of the largest was a 100-person sit-in at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare building in San Francisco that also included other social movements and people from the Black Panthers and other grassroots organizations, recognizing the inequity that existed for people with disabilities in the United States. Now, Section 504 of the Rehab Act states that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall be excluded from the participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And the operative word in this statement is otherwise qualified. This term has been highly contentious in litigation, but also in present day when we look at the practical applications of adaptive sport, whether it's at the high school level, collegiate level, or broadly in society. Largely, the working definition of otherwise qualified in the legal sense is that accommodations can be made within reason, something that would not fundamentally alter the nature of activity, nature of a program, a course, whatever it may be. So with regards to Section 504 of the Rehab Act, to make a claim on the case of athletics, a defendant must confirm that they are disabled, they are otherwise qualified, they were excluded on the basis of disability, and that they were excluded from a program or a benefactor from federal funding. In summary, the Rehab Act laid important groundwork for the ADA in the 1990 and has implications to this day about opportunities for students with disabilities in sport, in academics, and in work. Namely, what does otherwise qualified mean when it comes to reasonable accommodations? And where are institutions and organizations allowed to draw that line? And for what reasons? Furthermore, what constitutes a major life activity in one's day-to-day life? Can sport be considered a major life activity, given all of the impacts that it can have in an individual's life and their long-term outcomes beyond their athletic career? To get back to the timeline, in 1976, so the creation of the University of Texas Arlington Collegiate Adaptive Sport Program. They started off as the Freewheelers wheelchair basketball team led by Jim Hayes, who also began as the inaugural director of UTA's Office for Students with Disabilities. He formed the wheelchair basketball team to, quote, get disabled students out of their rut. The first Freewheelers team had 6 players, which included students and staff, as well as Jim Hayes as a player coach. The Movin' Mavs repeated as national champions in 92, 93, and 94, and were the first collegiate adaptive sport program to be invited to the White House for their accomplishments. Now, it is worth noting several points about the UTA program and its origins. First, many collegiate programs are started through the mechanism of drawing upon staff and community members. The University of Michigan program was very similar. It's a catch-22 situation that a lot of these programs and grassroots efforts face, especially within the collegiate system. when you're trying to recruit athletes, they ask, where's the team? But to build a team, you need to be able to recruit athletes. And it creates a situation where how do you build that pipeline such that people have that interest and ability to be able to participate at that level? Second, similar to Dr. Nugent, Jim Hayes was the Director of Services for Students with Disabilities. This is often the origin point for adaptive sport programs and is often where they reside in the long term, existing as segregated entities from rec sports, club sports, or athletic departments. And third, the impetus of the program, getting disabled students out of their rut, still marks tones of medical model of disability, pending the state of physical, mental, and social health on the individual, but not necessarily looking outward at the structural, social, and institutional environment that shape those health outcomes. In 1980, there was a creation of the wheelchair basketball program at the Edinburgh University campus in Erie, Pennsylvania. They started off as a recreational sport organization, but quickly grew into a competitive sport program that is still dominant in the sport today. In the late 90s, under the leadership of Jim Glatch, who is still the current head coach of the wheelchair basketball team there, moved the wheelchair basketball team to the athletic department at the university. And it was the first collegiate adaptive sport program, and presently only one of two in the country that exists within the athletic department of their institution alongside other NCAA sports. In 1985, there was the creation of the University of Arizona Adaptive Athletics Program. Today, they are one of the most diverse programs that exist in terms of their sport offerings, serving over 100 athletes in sports that range from paraswimming, adaptive golf, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, rugby, hand cycling, wheelchair track, bocce, sled hockey, and more. 1990 was a landmark year for disability rights with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else when it comes to participation in the mainstream of American life. Within the context of sport, the two most important titles of the ADA are Title II and Title III. Title II dealing with services, programs, or activities of a public entity, and Title III dealing with places of public accommodation. Courts have found, and including at the Supreme Court level, that Title II applies to public institutions, including high schools, colleges, universities, as well as high school athletic associations. Title III has been found to apply directly to the NCAA, but this is where case law becomes very interesting when it comes to the ADA and the culpability of the NCAA. A foundational case when we're looking at the ADA and its application to sport and operators of sport is the Casey Martin versus PGA Tour case back in the 90s. In this case, Martin sued the PGA Tour under the ADA to accommodate his disability by allowing him to use a golf cart in competition. The PGA Tour argued that its competitions cannot be considered public because they are reserved for the best and most elite golfers. However, the court found no reason for which performance of athletes becomes so elite that its governance is beyond accommodation, which can be said for high school athletic associations, could be said for collegiate governing bodies, whether it's NERSA, NCAA, what have you. The Supreme Court also stated that the golf cart permits access to competition that the individual would not otherwise be able to engage in because of disability. The PGA Tour attempted to argue that providing such an individualized assessment of Martin's case would place undue burden on them in the future, as it would create precedent for more people to request individualized accommodations when it comes to accessing sport and what reasonable modifications could be for people with disabilities to engage in PGA Tour events. However, the court countered that there are much more critical entities such as doctors and lawyers who must make these individualized assessments on a daily basis. And arguably, their decisions have greater burden and societal impact than golf does. In summary, the court ruled in favor of Martin and two major advancements were made with regards to the ADA as it applies to sport. One, that athletic operators could be subject to Title III, and that individualized assessment is a cornerstone when it comes to the application of ADA in these contexts. Why is this important? These foundational concepts and determinations from the Supreme Court can be applied to elementary schools, high schools, athletic associations, colleges, university, all the governing bodies that dictate and say who can and who can't participate in sport. In future cases like Tatiana McFadden versus the Maryland High School Athletic Association were predicated on this case. However, others have not yet reached its full course of inclusion as a result of ADA and this foundational case from Casey Martin, because there are still organizations like the Michigan High School Athletic Association and the NCAA that are still largely discriminatory in their practices for disabled populations. Going back to the timeline of collegiate adaptive sports, in approximately 2001 was the creation of collegiate wheelchair tennis and collegiate wheelchair tennis nationals. This competition has substantially grown over the last 20 plus years and is now managed by the Intercollegiate Tennis Association. And we're working towards a place where that is achieving parity with NCAA tennis, which has been remarkable improvement and growth in that sport. In 2003, there was the creation of the Alabama Adapted Athletics Program, which many regard as a benchmark for what adaptive sports should look like within the collegiate system. But again, I think there are points to be made for and against in terms of how that model is implemented that I'll expand upon further later. The 2010s saw a flourishing of adaptive sport programs at the collegiate level, with additions of Auburn, Michigan State, SDSU, Eastern Washington, CUNY, and Clemson. In 2013, there's a third major piece of legal action that occurred in the adaptive sport landscape that has direct implications on what we do in our work day to day. It is the 2013 Dear Colleague Letter, Students with Disabilities in Extracurricular Athletics. The attempt of this Dear Colleague Letter from the Office of Civil Rights was to clarify the obligations of schools to provide students with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in extracurricular athletics. There are many comparisons of this Dear Colleague Letter, the ADA, the Rehab Act, to the three-part effective accommodation test that is displayed and evident in Title IX and its application to collegiate sport. Most notably, the three-part effective accommodations test states that proportionality between participation opportunities and enrollment must exist. There must be a demonstrated history and practice of expanding opportunities, and there must be institutions and organizations must demonstrate that interest and ability have been fully and effectively met. But this all begs a question, coming from a 1970s Title IX case of Cohen versus Brown University, is interest and ability can't develop in a vacuum. They must develop as a function of opportunity and experience. Often is the case when we try to build programs like adaptive sports or other DE&I efforts, there's often the argument or counter argument that there's not enough interest, there's not enough participation in these initiatives to support something, whether it's financially, resources, time, effort, whatever it may be. But if that pathway and that opportunity never exists, how could that participation ever be fostered? How could that participation ever grow? Most importantly, the Dear Colleague Letter outlines strategies for expanding and creating opportunities for students with disabilities that went on to inform the creation of the ECAC Inclusive Sport Initiative that was largely spearheaded by the late Eli Wolf and Ted Fay, that were trailblazers in the space of collegiate adaptive sport. And largely the principles of sport inclusion are still implemented in some form today when we talk about NCAA inclusion. Most simply, I'll break it down as principle one being no modifications or alterations to rules or equipment. Now, this is for athletes that have a physical disability that are exceptional human beings in terms of what they can do, and are athletes that can get to the collegiate level and participate in able-bodied sports, not because of the system getting there, but despite the system and despite the stigmas that they endure as people and as athletes and as people that identify as having a disability. The second principle of sport inclusion include reasonable accommodations for athletes that do not fundamentally alter the nature of the event or the sport. So this is allowing athletes with prosthetics to compete in sport, athletes that are visually or hearing impaired to be able to compete in adaptive sport, compete in able-bodied sport competitions, One of the athletes on the screen here at the bottom left, Sam Grew, is actually a current medical student here at the University of Michigan and competes in the high jump at a national and international level, and is a defending gold medalist from the Tokyo Paralympic Games. He started his, a highlight of his competitive career was competing on the Notre Dame's able-bodied NCAA track and field team, where through a simple modification of adjusting the starting height or entry height for high jump, he was then able to represent and compete for the Notre Dame team. That doesn't fundamentally alter the nature of the event, but that slight modification makes an inclusive environment where opportunities arise for athletes like Sam. Principle 3 is the addition of events or competitions alongside able-bodied events where integration can't necessarily exist. Examples of this are wheelchair tennis or wheelchair track. And a great example of this is adding wheelchair track events to existing able-bodied meets at the NCAA level. Just this past year was the first time that wheelchair track was integrated as part of Drake Relays, dubbed as the Collegiate National Championships for wheelchair track. And principle 4 is around creating the addition of team sports where events cannot happen side by side. So examples of this would be wheelchair rugby, wheelchair basketball, goal ball, sitting volleyball, and other team-based sports such as those. In 2018, we had the arrival of University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness. While a relatively new program, the program has grown quite remarkably over the last several years, expanding to have a holistic scope of work that I'll discuss and expand upon shortly. In 2019, there was a historical merger and creation of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, exemplifying how these movements and how this body of work can exist in parallel, can be integrated together such that it can support parity when it comes to opportunity, support, and access. In 2023, there was the first ever collegiate wheelchair track national championships held at the Drake Relays, and the first integration of wheelchair tennis at the NCAA championships. And in 2024, we will see the first official integration of wheelchair track and wheelchair tennis at NCAA national championships. As we look across the current landscape of adaptive sport in the collegiate system, there are approximately 22 perennial programs that have some established programming in the core sports of wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, track and field, but also other sports that include wheelchair rugby, swimming, goalball, and sitting volleyball. The early paradigm of collegiate adaptive sport was that programs should exist at universities as a vehicle for rehabilitating the whole person, academically, physically, and socially. We look back upon Jim Hayes' quote of getting athletes and students out of their rut. This is still largely true in the message we seek to deliver and what we know about adaptive sports or sports in general, with regards to its benefit for one's physical, mental, and social health. However, the early view of adaptive sport largely mirrored what is referred to as a medical model of disability. The medical model of disability views disability as resulting from an individual person's physical or mental limitations, not in any connection to the physical, social, or political environment around them. The medical model focuses on fixing the person rather than fixing the environment. This line of thinking resulted in a lot of early success, however, when it comes to the development of collegiate adaptive sport programs, largely in recognition that sport is an excellent tool for supporting a disabled person's all-around success when it comes to work, life, and citizenship. The byproduct of this paradigm was a lot of programs that were built in a way that were segregated from the programs and structures that already existed in these spaces at the collegiate level. Bringing up the discussion is separate but equal, inherently unequal. While athletic, club sport, and rec sport departments exist, supporting athletic opportunities for disabled students was often taken on by disability service offices or resource centers. And this is still often the case for emerging adaptive sport programs. Because while the entities that govern rec and competitive sport opportunities should have adaptive sport opportunities as well, It is often a stone unturned or by and large ignored until highly motivated individuals challenge institutional equilibrium by starting a program on their own. And as a result, they are institutional game changers by bringing the social issue to the forefront at their respective institutions. While the overall method of segregation worked in the short term for building collegiate adaptive sport, it poses long-term challenges in terms of recognizing the equity and equality that should exist for people with disabilities when it comes to extracurricular activities and opportunities in campus life. The shift, however, that we're seeing in present day is that collegiate adaptive sport is mirroring the shift from the medical model of disability in society to the social model of disability, and it's happening across college campuses in the United States. This frame of thinking in collegiate adaptive sport is being viewed not just as a tool to support the health and wellness and success of disabled students, but as a platform that can bring together all students, faculty, academic disciplines, and schools. We are currently in the chapter of integration when it comes to the Chronicle of Collegiate Adaptive Sports, and it is something that we're pursuing here at the University of Michigan. And while I'm biased, I think it does make us leaders and best when it comes to this space, but it doesn't also stop us from collaborating with our collegiate partners across this landscape to find better ways and better opportunities to create an interconnected ecosystem when it comes to supporting adaptive sports. While the program originally supported sport opportunities for people with disabilities at the University of Michigan and in the community, we have expansively grown over the last several years, understanding that our place, our position as a program, we can have influence when it comes to the pathways through which people access health and wellness opportunities. And that this is something that can be beneficial not only for people with disabilities, but people with and without disabilities. To summarize the overall scope of work that we do with adaptive sports and fitness, we have a student group that focuses on engaging the student population at the University of Michigan through awareness and educational events, demos, and clinics. We have an adaptive sports research consortium that focuses on bringing together and connecting with other universities to expand upon research efforts in the adaptive sports space, which has been largely underinvested in, whether it's from the sociological perspective or whether it's from the sport science perspective. We have the Adaptive Sport and Inclusive Recreation Initiative, where we are actively embedding adaptive sport as part of the general physical education curriculum in Ann Arbor Public Schools, and soon to be expanding to Ypsilanti and Lincoln Middle Schools as well. Recognizing that when you look at the physical education standards for the state of Michigan and other states across the country, all of the state standards talk about getting from point A to point B, achieving an objective with a team, throwing an object with accuracy. All of these different state standards and guidelines can be achieved through adaptive sport. And by way of adaptive sport, we can allow people to have access to those physical opportunities, make friends with their peers, and talk about concepts of equity and inclusion, diversity, and disability in that K-12 setting. We have the Adaptive Student Athlete Program, which is focused on the integration efforts and inclusion efforts of adaptive sport within NCAA competitions, like the Drake Relays, like Collegiate Wheelchair Tennis Nationals, and so forth. We have Prescription to Play, where we're focused on engaging the healthcare community, medical students, practitioners in Michigan medicine, and having them contribute to the growth of adaptive sports. And I'll talk about that initiative a little bit further in the near future here. We also have adaptive fitness and adaptive sports, providing fitness, recreational, and competitive sport opportunities for not only students at the University of Michigan, but community members in the Southeast Michigan area. Again, supporting able-bodied inclusion, knowing that it provides an opportunity for people to have community connections, to have social opportunities, to dismantle the stigma around disability and what adaptive sports is and can be. One of the things that we try to achieve with the adaptive sports and fitness program at the University of Michigan is building the pipeline, building the connection points or the network in adaptive sport so that people have the opportunity to get connected in any which pathway that they might be on in life. The unique thing about adaptive sport is that one can enter this space in the world of disability at any point in their life. You can be born with a disability and you can acquire a disability. And with that, the inclusion and introduction to adaptive sport can look very complex. A model that I think illustrates this very well is the Canadian Sport for Life model, or the long-term athlete development model, which clearly illustrates a spectrum of sport participation that ranges from an active start to being active for life, inclusive of all the stages of being an athlete and being involved in sport that include fundamentals, learning to train, training to compete, and training to win. All of these different levels of sport are necessary when we look at the ecosystem of inclusion and involvement. When we think about our able-bodied experiences, you almost have to turn away from or deny participation in sport. It's prevalent after school, in gym class, on the playground, extracurricular involvement. It's prevalent in all areas and aspects of our lives. But for people with disabilities, that's by and large not the case. They don't have those same mechanisms or mediums to be introduced to sport. And we have to identify the role that we play as practitioners, whether we're coaches, physicians, teachers, parents, in what we can do to create those pathways and establish those connections so that people with disabilities have the opportunity to access sport. So when we look at the adaptive sport landscape within the United States, those different levels of sport engagement exist. Whether you're someone that's new to sport, whether you're looking to pursue sport at the highest degree, like with the national team and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, or whether you're looking to have an active start with organizations like UMAIS, or be active for life through organizations like the Great Lakes Adaptive Sports Association. There's a growing base of collegiate adaptive sport programs as well across the country. But the issue right now is that there's no real connectivity between these different areas of work. In a lot of ways, these efforts are siloed. And as a result, there's a leaky pipeline when it comes to sport participation for people with disabilities. People with disabilities may not be introduced to sport later on in life because they weren't in a geographical place or had people in their lives that connected to them to sport, whether it was their educators, primary care physicians, or other people of influence in their lives. Some people may have had an active start, but then moved on to college or moved to another area of the country where they didn't have the same modalities and abilities to be connected to sport, or they didn't know of what the next steps were in terms of their involvement of sport, whether it was recreationally or competitively. We're starting to see organizations come up in terms of their reach, like Move United, that has a scope of work that is trying to bridge these connections between these different levels or tiers of sport. But again, this is very early stages in terms of the work that is being done and building a pipeline that is sustainable so that at any stage in life, somebody with a disability is connected to sport. We don't have the time now, but we do have a video here that will hopefully be made available later of our work in the Adaptive Sport and Inclusive Recreation Initiative, where we're embedding adaptive sport as part of the PE curriculum. This is an important primary site for people to be introduced to sport because they then have the opportunity theoretically to go on and compete in college and be active for life. Developing those healthy habits early in their lives is going to be fundamental, not only in terms of their physical health, but as mentioned earlier, all the different transferable skills and benefits that come from sport participation. To talk about prescription to play specifically, we strongly believe that healthcare practitioners and providers can be a fundamental linchpin when it comes to accessing sport, recognizing that there are quite literally ways that practitioners can quite literally prescribe play to people, whether it's connecting to them, connecting patients that they see to local adaptive sport programs, recognizing different disabilities and how that might qualify or make someone eligible for adaptive sport, doing demos or clinics that support sport introduction and participation. And to talk about prescription to play specifically, some of the work that we actively do as part of this initiative, and that I hope we can connect further on later with urology and with other departments within Michigan Medicine. We do tabling events and information sessions as shown on the far left. We do demos and clinics where we bring in students, physicians, OTs, PTs, all disciplines to try adaptive sports for themselves, whether it be wheelchair basketball, sitting volleyball, or many of the other sport opportunities that we offer. And we also go and visit clinics as well to provide equipment introductions for PTs, OTs, physicians, and people that frequent those clinics as well, because those patients are directly the people that can benefit from having firsthand experience with equipment and understanding what that looks like, what that feels like, so that they can be, so that can be part of their rehabilitation process in the future. There are also other organizations and institutions across the country doing this work similar to Prescription to Play. And a great model that exists is an event called RecFest, operated by Penn State Health. This is an event that we participated in last year and supported by bringing some of our staff and equipment to help facilitate the organization and implementation of this event. But Penn State Health comes together across all disciplines through urology, PM&R, and all the different disciplines and departments that exist within their health network to put on a multi-day clinic and a larger single-day event that brings together various forms of physical activity opportunities, whether it's sport, leisure, recreation, so that practitioners, students, and people of the community have that firsthand experience of the opportunities that exist, but also how to then directly get connected with opportunities within the local community. There's a great need for research when we look at the space of adaptive sport. And by and large, when you look in Google Scholar and other resources, you are going to find very little when it comes to technology and innovation and research when it comes to adaptive sport. And this is an area of great need across all disciplines. A great example of this and some of the work that is being done is the work being done at Gallaudet University, which is a school that was founded for the deaf. They partnered with AT&T to create a 5G helmet that allows for AR and VR communication between coaches on the bench and on the sidelines to athletes on the field wearing the helmets, having play calls displayed in their field of vision. There's also a great need in examining principles of inclusion when it comes to adaptive sport with able-bodied sport. There are many controversial opinions and research studies out there around strategic advantages or competitive advantages when it comes to athletes that wear prosthetics competing in able-bodied competition. But furthermore, there's growing complexity as we look further and further into this subject, particularly for below the knee and above the knee amputees, and how those joints work biomechanically. And there's a great amount of research that needs to happen when it comes to the ergonomic impact of that, the chronic health impact of that, but also the performance aspect and understanding how we can invest in technology that supports the performance of these athletes. There's research being done at Loughborough University in the United Kingdom, which is one of the most, I would say, expansive research labs when it comes to adaptive sport in the collegiate space right now. They do all kinds of physiological sport testing when it comes to seated athletes and ambulatory athletes in the adaptive space, like this wheelchair rugby athlete doing VO2 max testing. There's also work that needs to be done when it comes to different impacts, environmental impacts when it comes to training and performance, but how that also connects to physiological systems within the person on the basis of disability. So specifically, when you look at different populations that participate in adaptive sports, like the spinal cord injury community, there are many implications when you look at the parasympathetic and the nervous system and how that is all activated and how that is all impacted through sport participation, especially at maximal exertion in different environments and in different contexts. And lastly, the research area that I want to bring up is around autonomic dysreflexia. Again, very prominent within the spinal cord injury community, particularly that plays wheelchair rugby. Autonomic dysreflexia is a result of the autonomic nervous system going in hyperdrive. And there are kind of cases where athletes have intentionally inflicted this response to increase their performance in the sport, which ultimately also has severe health outcomes or health risks as well when people are intentionally inflicting this upon themselves, whether it's drinking a lot and hydrating a lot before playing, and not releasing that, whether it's physically inflicting pain upon themselves to elicit this response, whatever it may be. When it comes to the ethics of sport, of course, this is in some respect performance enhancing, but this is also a significant health risk for these athletes as well. So as we look at the overall future of collegiate adaptive sport and the opportunities that exist, education is at the forefront and still needs to happen, whether it's in the university setting, whether it's in the healthcare setting, K to 12. The more people know about adaptive sport, the more people know that it exists, the better, because we all play a role in facilitating people's efficacy when it comes to their involvement in physical activity. K to 12 programming will be a primary site for the growth of participation in adaptive sport, but also in terms of educating PE teachers and other educators when it comes to facilitating these opportunities. Representation. I challenge everyone to think about this statement that comes from Title IX, because I think it broadly applies to all areas of work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The principles of sport inclusion are something that is ongoing and being contested and being applied in the collegiate space as we speak. And there's ongoing research and ongoing discussions to understand what is the most ethical way and what is the most practical way we can integrate adaptive sport as part of the NCAA and other able-bodied environments. And lastly, I think when we look at the future of collegiate adaptive sport, we really have to examine able-bodied inclusion as a driver of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, understanding that when we look at the definition of parasport and adaptive sport, it's about the modification of equipment or rules that allows for equitable participation. That inherently means that adaptive sport doesn't inherently need to be only for people with disabilities. It can be something that we can all participate in, and understanding how that then has a larger impact in terms of our views upon disability. Overall, whether or not NCAA inclusion is the appropriate end goal, I think there are actions taken over the course of this process that are going to contribute to the growth and success of the parasport movement. And I think adaptive sport provides a unique opportunity for collaboration and innovation across fields of study and disciplines. Thank you all for listening to this presentation this morning. Happy to take any questions for those that want to stick around. The work that we're doing in the K to 12 system, specifically in the middle schools, is getting kids active, is introducing physical activity as something that they can participate in if they're given the right resources, support, and tools, whether it's the lesson plan, the curriculum, the equipment. When it comes to the facilitators of physical activity involvement, of course, most directly, we can look at the teachers and their instruction and their ability to lead such initiatives within the K to 12 system. But again, when we look at healthcare practitioners and primary care providers, these are people that regularly see patients with disabilities all through their kind of K to 12 career. And if more practitioners can talk to their patients about adaptive sport opportunities that exist, whether it's in the K to 12 setting or whether it's community efforts that exist in the exist locally, that can greatly support the participation and access when it comes to adaptive sport participation for people with disabilities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's great to hear.
We'll have it put it out. Yeah, it is. We're gonna put it on our website.
Oh, fantastic.